I had exactly $11 in my pocket and a broken suitcase with a busted wheel that scraped against the wet pavement with every step I took. I was 17 years old, 3 months pregnant, standing in the rain outside a house in Nashville, Tennessee, that still had my bedroom light on inside. My mother had turned it on after I left. I think she wanted me to see it from the street, to see what I was walking away from, what I was being erased from. The front door was locked. The deadbolt I had never once heard in 17 years of living there was thrown for the first time that night. And the sound of it, that single, sharp, metallic click, became the sound I heard every time someone tried to tell me I wasn't enough. I didn't know it then. But that $11 and that scraping suitcase wheel were the first two things I would ever truly own. Let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened 23 years later in a courtroom in Nashville wasn't just justice. It was the closing argument of a life they tried to write off. My name is Carolyn Rees. I am 40 years old. I run a forensic financial consulting firm called Meriden Trace out of a glass building in downtown Nashville. And I have spent the last 15 years helping federal prosecutors follow money through the dark. I know how debt hides. I know how signatures lie. I know exactly what a forged document looks like when it's been cleaned up and pressed into a legal brief, because I have unraveled hundreds of them. What I did not know until 23 years after that locked door was that my own parents had been using my name to build a financial architecture so corrupt, so deliberate, and so personal that when my lead analyst finally laid it out across my conference table, he looked up at me and said quietly, "Caroline, this isn't negligence. This is a campaign." But before we get to that conference table, before we get to the courtroom, and the moment the judge asked my father to please sit down and stop speaking, I need to tell you about the house. I need to tell you about the dining room and the smell of my mother's sweet tea, and the way my father's voice dropped 2 octaves whenever he had already decided something was finished. Nashville in early spring smells like jasmine and motor oil, and the particular kind of ambition that comes from a city that believes it is perpetually on the verge of becoming something larger than it already is. My parents, Robert and Diane Rees, had lived in the same house in Brentwood for 30 years. It was a wide colonial style home with white columns out front and a flag holder by the door that always flew something seasonal. Robert was a commercial real estate broker. Diane organized fundraisers for the kind of charities that put your name on a bronze plaque in a hospital lobby. They were the sort of people who smiled at you in the driveway and shook hands at the right events, and had a daughter, me, whom they spent the better part of 17 years positioning as an extension of their brand. I was not the rebellious one. I was not the difficult child. I made honor roll. I played piano at the church Christmas concert every December, and I folded the bulletins for Sunday service, and I smiled in every photograph they ever took, because I had learned early that my value in that house was directly proportional to how well I reflected them. My older brother Davis was the one they worried about. Davis drank too much at 16 and crashed the truck my father bought him, and once got suspended for 3 days for reasons no one in our family ever discussed in full sentences. But Davis was the heir. Davis was the legacy. Davis was the one whose name my father said with a kind of ownership that felt almost physical. And I was the one who kept the machine running quietly in the background. So when I told them I was pregnant, and at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night in March, the reaction I received was not grief. It was not even anger in the way that anger comes from love. It was administrative. My father set down his fork. My mother folded her hands. And Robert Rees, the man who had coached my little league softball team and taught me to parallel park in an empty church lot on a Sunday morning, looked at me across the table and said, in a voice as flat and final as a closing contract, "You've made yourself a liability, Caroline, and we don't carry liabilities in this family." My mother didn't argue with him. She never argued with him about anything that had already been decided. She just reached over and moved my plate to the side of the table, as if clearing the space in front of me was a gentler way of clearing me from the room. She said, "You can take the blue suitcase from the hall closet. Leave your house key on the counter." And that was it, 23 seconds. That was the length of my expulsion from the only life I had ever known. My father went back to his dinner. My mother started talking about a fundraiser she was planning for the spring. I sat there for another full minute waiting for one of them to look up. Neither of them did. I found the suitcase, I left the key, I didn't say goodbye to Davis because Davis wasn't home, and honestly, I'm not sure it would have changed anything. I walked out the front door into a night that smelled like rain and fresh cut grass, and behind me, I heard the deadbolt slide home, and that was the last sound I associated with safety for a very long time. The bus I took went north toward Memphis before cutting west. And I rode it for 6 hours sitting next to a woman named Gloria, who sold handmade quilts at farmers markets and who, after I had been crying silently for about 40 minutes, handed me a square of fabric from her bag without a word. I still have that fabric. It sits in a small cedar box on my desk at Meridian Trace. And every time I open that box, I can smell the particular combination of cedar and old cotton that reminds me that the first person who showed me kindness after that night was a stranger on a bus. I ended up in Memphis. I was not there by plan. I was there because that is where my money ran out. I found a room in a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Hartwell who charged $60 a week and who, upon learning I was pregnant and alone, charged me 40 and told me not to tell the other tenants. Mrs. Hartwell was 67 years old and had the disposition of a woman who had seen every variety of human foolishness and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She found me work at a diner 2 blocks away, and she let me use her personal medical card for my prenatal appointments. She never asked me to pay her back. She said once, when I tried to bring it up, "The only thing you owe me is to do the same for somebody else someday." That's the whole system, Caroline. The whole entire system. I lost the baby at 4 months. A Tuesday morning, alone in Mrs. Hartwell's bathroom, the kind of loss that has no language adequate to contain it. There is nothing I can write here that will make that fact feel like anything other than what it was, which was the most isolating grief I have ever carried. I did not call my parents. I did not know how to call my parents. I did not know in that moment if I even wanted them to know because the baby had been the reason they locked the door and now the reason was gone. And I understood with a cold, nauseating clarity that even if I called, the door would still be locked. The reason had never really been the baby. The reason was that I had inconvenienced the image, and that was not the kind of thing that healed with a phone call. What I did instead was work. Mrs. Hartwell watched me the way experienced people watch someone who is using productivity as a container for grief. And she didn't try to stop me. She just kept feeding me and keeping the room and saying occasionally, "You don't have to be okay yet, baby, but you do have to eat." I worked at the diner for 2 years. I saved. I enrolled in a community college on a Tuesday night after a shift, still smelling like coffee and grease, and I registered for an accounting course because it was the cheapest path I could see to a stable floor. I was 19 years old and I had nothing except a very specific and finely sharpened understanding of what it felt like to be treated like a number on a ledger, and I decided that if that was the language the world spoke, I was going to become fluent in it. I graduated from that community college with honors. I transferred on a partial scholarship to the University of Tennessee. I worked every hour that I was not studying. I graduated with a degree in accounting and then went back for a graduate certification in forensic finance, which is the discipline that sits at the intersection of accounting, law enforcement, as in the particular art of finding what someone has tried to make disappear. I was good at it in the way that only people who have personally experienced erasure can be good at finding it. I knew what hidden looked like. I had been hidden myself. By the time I was 30, I had worked for 2 federal agencies and one of the largest forensic accounting firms in the Southeast. By 35, I had founded Meridian Trace with 2 colleagues and a client list that grew faster than our office could accommodate. We moved into the glass building on Commerce Street when I was 38, and I stood in my corner office on the day we moved in and looked out at the Nashville skyline and thought of the deadbolt. I thought of it without anger. I had been thinking of it without anger for several years by then. I had done a great deal of work to get to a place where the memory of that sound was just a memory, not a wound. I thought I was finished with it. I was wrong. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday in October. My assistant, a meticulous and unflappable woman named Priya, brought it in with my morning coffee and set it on the corner of my desk with the particular careful neutrality she used when something had made her uncertain. It was a standard business envelope, no return address, postmarked Nashville. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a photograph. The paper contained 4 lines of typed text. The photograph showed my father, Robert Reese, sitting across a conference table from 2 men I did not recognize, signing a document. In the bottom right corner of the photograph, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone trained in document forensics, was the header of the document in front of him. It read, Rees Family Irrevocable Trust, Amendment 7, Secondary Beneficiary Removal. I set the photograph down on my desk. I picked up my coffee. I put the phone face down. Then I waited. I did not call my parents. I did not call a lawyer. I called my lead analyst, a former IRS investigator named Dwight Calloway, who had been with me at Meridian Trace since the first year, and who had the rare and specific gift of being able to look at a financial document and tell you not just what it said, but what it was trying not to say. I put the photograph in front of him. He looked at it for about 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said, Where did this come from? I told him I didn't know yet. He said, Do you want me to find out what Amendment 7 did? I said, Yes. He said he would need 48 hours. He needed 36. What Dwight laid out across the conference table 2 days later was not a simple story. It was a structure. My parents had established the Rees Family Irrevocable Trust in 1987, 4 years before I was born, as part of a broader estate planning arrangement tied to my father's commercial real estate portfolio. The trust held the family home, 3 investment properties in the Nashville area, and a brokerage account that had grown over 3 decades to just over $2.3 million. The original trust named 2 beneficiaries, Davis Rees, and upon her birth, Caroline Rees, equal shares, standard family arrangement, Amendment 7, executed 14 months prior to the day Dwight put the documents in front of me, had removed my name entirely. Not reduced my share. Removed it. My father had retained a trust attorney named Gerald Foss, and together they had drafted a modification that cited, and I want you to hear this clearly, voluntary and permanent estrangement from the family unit as grounds for beneficiary removal under the discretionary clause. The discretionary clause. I had been estranged because they locked a deadbolt when I was 17 and then spent 23 years telling people I had chosen to leave. And now they had used that manufactured estrangement as the legal mechanism to cut me out of a $2.3 million trust. But that was not the part that made Dwight look at me the way he did. The part that made Dwight look at me that way was the signature. On the original trust document, established in 1987, there was a provision called a secondary beneficiary consent clause. It was a relatively unusual addition, likely recommended by the original estate attorney as a protective measure, and it stated that any amendment removing a named beneficiary required either the written consent of that beneficiary or a court order establishing legal grounds for removal. My father had not obtained my consent. There was no court order. Instead, on the signature line reserved for my consent, there was a signature, my name, signed, notarized, dated 14 months ago on a Thursday in August at a notary office in Brentwood. I had not been in Brentwood on a Thursday in August 14 months ago. I had been in Washington, D.C., presenting testimony before a Senate subcommittee on financial fraud. I had the transcript, I had the travel records, I had the hotel bill. I had not signed anything. Someone had signed for me. I looked at Dwight across the table. He said quietly, Caroline, this isn't negligence. This is a campaign. I sat with that for a moment. The room smelled like coffee and the faint chemical sharpness of new carpet. Outside the window, Nashville was doing what Nashville does on a clear October afternoon, which is gleam with a kind of aggressive optimism that makes you feel both energized and vaguely implicated. I said, pull the notary license, find out who certified that signature. Dwight said, already running it. He paused. There's one more thing. He turned over the last page of the documents. There. As in the transaction history of the brokerage account held within the trust was a series of transfers. 12 of them, spread across the previous 18 months, totaling $840,000, moved in increments of $60,000 to $90,000 each, from the trust brokerage account to a private LLC registered in Delaware. The LLC was called Cornerstone Horizon Ventures. Dwight had already traced it. The registered agent was Davis Rees. This was the moment I understood that what I was looking at was not a family dispute. It was a coordinated financial crime. My brother Davis had been quietly liquidating my share of the trust, laundering the proceeds through a Delaware shell company he had registered under a name designed to sound legitimate, with the full knowledge and participation of my father, who had used a forged version of my signature to make the removal of my name appear legally valid. They had not just cut me out. They had been actively stealing what was mine for 18 months, and they had used my own name to do it. I did not feel rage. I know that might seem strange, but by the time you have spent 15 years doing what I do, you understand that rage is expensive and imprecise. What I felt was something closer to the particular cold clarity of an auditor who has just located the source of a discrepancy. I knew exactly what it was. I knew exactly what to do with it, and I knew with the kind of certainty that does not require emotion to be real that it was already over for them. They just didn't know it yet. I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Park, who had been my personal counsel for 6 years and who, yes, in 6 years, I had never called about anything personal. When she picked up and I told her what I had, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Have you touched any of this publicly?" I said no. She said, "Good. Keep it that way. I'm coming to you." Sandra arrived at Meridian Trace within the hour. She sat across from me and Dwight, and she went through every document with the focused attention of someone who is simultaneously building a case and making sure the case is unassailable. When she finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the table and said, "I want to be very clear about what you have here. You have a forged, notarized signature on a legal trust document, which is felony forgery in Tennessee. You have wire fraud through the interstate LLC transfers. You have fiduciary breach by the trustee. It's your father. You have $840,000 in traceable misappropriation. And you have a consent clause violation that invalidates the entire amendment as a matter of contract law, regardless of the fraud charges." She paused. "This is not a civil matter, Caroline. This is federal." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you want to pursue this?" I said, "I want to pursue this the way I pursue everything, completely." Sandra nodded. Then she said the thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. "This isn't revenge, Caroline. This is justice." We spent the next 3 weeks building what Sandra called the architecture of consequence. Dwight pulled the metadata from the scanned trust documents, which revealed that the forged signature page had been digitally created using a PDF editing suite and had a timestamp placing its creation not at the notary office in Brentwood, but on a laptop registered to a business address belonging to Gerald Foss, the trust attorney. The notary who had certified the signature, a woman named Patrice Dunbar, had her license pulled 4 years earlier for an unrelated certification irregularity and had been working as a notary through a private arrangement rather than a licensed office, which meant the notarization itself was legally invalid under Tennessee code. Every layer we pulled revealed another layer underneath it. Dwight kept saying, "They weren't careful because they didn't think anyone was looking." That is the fatal assumption of every financial criminal I have ever pursued, that they forget that the absence of a watchdog is not the same as the absence of evidence. The wire transfer records from Cornerstone Horizon Ventures painted a clear picture of where the $840,000 had gone. $212,000 had been used to pay off a defaulted commercial mortgage on a property Davis had purchased under his own name in Franklin, Tennessee, and which had been 30 days from foreclosure. The remainder had been distributed in a pattern consistent with personal expenses, luxury purchases, and at least one payment to a lobbying firm that had done work for my father's real estate company. Davis, it turned out, it had been operating at a substantial financial deficit for several years and had been using the trust as a personal correction mechanism with my father's blessing and my forged authorization. When Sandra presented the full package to the assistant U.S. attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee, the AUSA looked at it for a very long time and then said, "This is unusually clean for a family case." Sandra said, "She's unusually good at what she does." Now I need to tell you about the gala, because the gala is where the structural elegance of 23 years of patience made itself visible in a room full of people who had known my parents their entire lives. The Reese family had been lead sponsors of the Nashville Heritage Preservation Society Gala for 11 consecutive years. Yes, it was the kind of event that my mother organized with the intensity of a military operation. A ballroom at the Omni Hotel, 300 attendees, the kind of donors who had buildings named after them, and who valued their association with the Reese name precisely because the Reese name had always appeared clean. My father was scheduled to receive the Society's Cornerstone Legacy Award that evening, a plaque, a speech, a photograph in the program, the culmination of a reputation built over decades on the surface of a character that had never actually existed. Sandra and I had discussed whether to move before or after the gala. The federal criminal referral was already submitted. The civil suit for trust misappropriation and fraud had been filed under seal 3 days prior. So the asset freeze on Cornerstone Horizon Ventures and on Davis Reese's personal accounts had been executed that morning, which meant that by the time my father walked into the Omni Hotel ballroom that evening, his son's accounts were frozen, the shell company was locked, and the forensic audit trail was sitting in a federal prosecutor's office. My father did not know any of this. My father thought, as of that morning, that everything was exactly as it had always been. He thought the trust amendment was valid. He thought the forged signature was buried. He thought I was 200 miles away, running my firm, having no idea what had been done to me. He thought that because he had always thought that. He had thought 23 years ago that a locked door and a bus ticket's worth of absence would keep me from ever becoming the kind of person who could look at what he had built and take it apart thread by thread. That is the misunderstanding that costs people everything. I arrived at the gala at 7:45, 15 minutes after the cocktail hour began, wearing a dark green dress that Priya had picked out and that I had initially resisted, and then worn because Priya is almost never wrong about things that matter. I walked into the ballroom and took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood near the edge of the room and looked at 300 people who had known the Reese name for decades and who were about to watch it mean something different. My father was near the front of the room, as shaking hands with the kind of two-handed handshake that men use when they want to signal that they are both powerful and warm. My mother was beside him in a pale blue dress, the kind of composed social performance she had always been extraordinary at. My brother Davis was not there, because Davis's accounts had been frozen that morning, and Davis was, at that moment, I would later learn, on the phone with a lawyer in a parking garage 2 miles away, trying to understand what had happened to his money. I did not approach my parents immediately. I found a seated table near the back, and I watched the room operate. I listened to the sound of crystal and conversation and the low thrum of a string quartet playing something I recognize as Debussy. As the ballroom smelled of white roses and warm bread and the particular expensive perfume that my mother had worn since I was a child, which reached me across the room like a memory I had not asked to have. The award presentation was scheduled for 9 o'clock. At 8:45, a hotel staff member approached my table and quietly confirmed that the AV team had received the materials I had sent via secure upload that afternoon and that everything was ready. I thanked him and put my phone face down on the table. Then I waited. Robert Reese received his award with the grace of a man who genuinely believed he deserved it. He stood at the podium in the front of the ballroom, holding a brass plaque, and he spoke about legacy and community and the importance of building something that outlasts you. Again, he said the word family 3 times in a speech that lasted 4 minutes, and every time he said it, I watched the people at the front tables nod with the kind of earnest approval that is only possible when you do not have access to the information that changes what that word means. He finished his speech. The applause was warm and sustained. He stepped back from the podium and accepted a handshake from the society's president. And then the screen behind the podium, which had been displaying a tasteful slide of Nashville architecture, went dark. A murmur moved through the room. My father turned, puzzled, and gestured toward the event coordinator. The screen did not return to the architecture slide. Instead, it displayed a single document page, enlarged to fill the entire surface. Yes, it was Amendment 7 of the Reese Family Irrevocable Trust. The signature line was highlighted in yellow. The room went very quiet. A voice, recorded, calm and clear, began to speak through the ballroom's audio system. It was Dwight's voice. He had recorded a 4-minute summary of the forensic findings, designed to be comprehensible to a non-specialist audience, explaining what the document was, what the signature line represented, and what the metadata analysis had revealed about the document's actual origin. He spoke without drama. He used precise language. He cited the Tennessee Code sections relevant to the forgery charge. He referenced the federal wire fraud statute applicable to the LLC transfers. He stated the total amount misappropriated, $840,000. He stated whose name had been forged. And then he said, the full forensic report and all supporting documentation has been submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Tennessee and is now a matter of public record. The slide changed. It was the wire transfer records, each transaction highlighted. The slide changed again. It was the Delaware LLC registration. Davis Reese's name clearly visible as registered agent. The slide changed one final time. It was a photograph of the notary, Patrice Dunbar, whose invalid license status was displayed beside her name, along with the date she had purportedly certified my signature. My father had turned the color of the white tablecloths. Like he was holding the brass plaque with both hands, and he was standing completely still in the way that people stand, when the only thing keeping them upright is the fact that they have not yet processed what is happening. My mother had sat down. She was looking at the table in front of her. I recognized that position. That was the position she had been in the night I told him I was pregnant. She was looking at the table and waiting for someone to make the problem disappear and beginning to understand that this time no one was going to. I stood up from my table at the back of the room and walked toward the front. And the crowd parted in that instinctive way that crowds part when they sense that something real is about to occur. I reached the podium and I stood beside it, not behind it, because I did not need the microphone. But the room was so quiet that I could hear the string quartet in the corner, who had stopped playing, and the hum of the hotel ventilation system, and my own breathing, which was slow and steady in the way that only comes from having known for a very long time that this moment was coming. I looked at my father. He looked at me. He looked older than I expected. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the particular way that exposure reduces people. He said in a voice that was barely audible and that contained, I think, the first genuinely unperformed emotion I had heard from him in my entire life, Caroline. I said, I'm not here to embarrass you, Robert. I'm here because what you did was a crime. Oh, and the people in this room have known you for decades, and they deserve to know what that means. He started to say something about family. He said the word. He actually used it. I let him finish the sentence. Then I said, you used the word family in your speech tonight 3 times. I counted. The last time someone in this family used that word to my face, I was 17 years old and standing in the rain with $11 and a broken suitcase. You locked the door. You forged my name on a legal document to remove my inheritance. You watched your son steal $840,000 through a shell company while my name was on the paperwork. That is what your version of family means. The evidence is now public record. I would suggest you retain counsel. I turned and walked back toward the edge of the room. Behind me, I heard the society's president say something quietly to my father. I heard the sound of chairs moving. I did not look back. The ballroom had the particular suspended quality of a room full of people who are each independently recalibrating what they thought they knew, which is the sound justice makes in the moment before it becomes permanent. The federal case moved with the momentum that well-documented fraud cases tend to move with when the forensic trail is unambiguous. Robert Reese was indicted on 2 counts of felony forgery, 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Davis Reese was indicted on 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering through the Delaware LLC. Gerald Foss, the trust attorney, surrendered his law license and entered a cooperation agreement with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge, and his testimony regarding the deliberate falsification of the notarized signature was, Sandra told me, the most damaging single piece of evidence in the government's case. The civil suit for trust restoration was resolved prior to trial through a court-supervised settlement in which the full value of my beneficiary share, including the $840,000 in misappropriated funds plus interest and legal costs, was restored. The family home in Brentwood was liquidated as part of the settlement. The 3 investment properties were attached. The brokerage account was placed under court supervision pending the criminal proceedings. The criminal case went to trial in the spring. And on the day my father was sentenced, I was not in the courtroom. I had testified during the evidentiary phase, and I had done what I needed to do. I did not need to watch the sentencing. My lawyer called me when it was over. Robert Reese received a sentence of 4 years. with 2 suspended on condition of full restitution compliance and no contact with the plaintiff. Davis Reese received 3 years and was required to complete 200 hours of financial fraud counseling, which I found both procedurally appropriate and almost poetically ironic. My mother had not been charged, as the evidence did not establish her direct participation in the forgery or the transfers, but the social architecture of her life had collapsed with everything else. She moved, I was told by someone who still knew people in Brentwood, to a smaller place outside of Murfreesboro. She did not reach out to me, I did not reach out to her. 1 year later, Meridian Trace moved into a larger office on the top floor of the same building on Commerce Street. I kept my corner window. On the morning we moved the last of the boxes, Priya brought me coffee and set it on my desk and then set beside it the cedar box, which she had packed herself and clearly treated with care. I opened it. The square of quilt fabric from Gloria on the bus. The woven cord bracelet from Mrs. Hartwell, who had passed 3 years prior at the age of 89 in the boarding house she had run for 40 years, having never stopped charging the people who needed at most $40 a week and asking nothing in return. I held the bracelet for a moment. I thought about Mrs. Hartwell saying, "The only thing you owe me is to do the same for somebody else someday." That's the whole entire system. The Meridian Trace Foundation launched its first grant cycle that fall. We fund forensic accounting education for students who are first-generation college attendees and who come from financially exploitative family situations, which is a category of vulnerability that the legal and academic systems have historically underserved and which I am, by any reasonable accounting, uniquely positioned to address. In our first year, we funded 11 students. In our second year, 19. Priya runs the selection committee. Dwight teaches a pro bono evidence workshop for grant recipients every spring. We do not put anyone's name on a bronze plaque. I kept the $11. They are in the cedar box, 3 bills folded once. They are not a trophy. They are not a reminder of what was taken. They are the first entry in the ledger of a life I built without permission, on a foundation that no one helped me pour, in a language I taught myself because I needed it to survive. My parents believed that throwing me out in the rain would keep me small. What it actually did was teach me, at the age of 17, that the floor I was standing on could be taken at any moment, and that the only floor worth trusting was one you had built yourself. I do not need them to understand that. I do not need them to apologize. The audit is complete. The books are balanced. The account is closed. What I need and what I have is the view from this window, the hum of this building, and the knowledge that somewhere tonight there is a 17-year-old sitting on a bus next to a stranger with a broken suitcase and not enough money, who has not yet understood that the locked door behind them is not the end of the story. It is the first sentence. If you have ever been handed a door that locked from the outside and told that what was behind it was the only version of home that existed for you, I want you to know that the door was wrong. You are not defined by who closed it. You are defined by every step you took after you heard the bolt slide home. Please subscribe, share this story with someone who needs it, and tell me in the comments what was the door in your life and what did you build after you walked away from it. I will read every single one.